When Vanessa first mentioned the graduation dinner, I knew it wasn't an invitation. It was a command, a formality, a performance meant for her family, not an act of love or partnership. I had seen the way she spoke about me to them, the little eye rolls, the sighs, the subtle, almost imperceptible hints of condescension in her voice whenever she said, "Oh, David? Yeah, he's doing his thing at that restaurant." That restaurant, the one I had built, the one I had sacrificed sleep for, the one I had poured every ounce of ambition into while she and her family assumed I was just another man with a dead-end job. She told me about the dinner 2 weeks prior, casually mentioning it while scrolling through her phone. "Rachel's graduation party is on Saturday. We're having dinner at Westwood. You should probably come." Probably. Not "I'd love for you to come." Not "it would mean a lot to Rachel." Just a passive, dismissive probably, as though my presence was nothing more than an afterthought. I had long since stopped correcting her, stopped trying to make her see me differently. It wasn't worth the energy. Vanessa had made up her mind about me years ago, before she even truly knew who I was. "What time?" I asked. "8. Where's something nice?" That last part? That was deliberate. It was her way of saying, "Don't embarrass me." She had spent years trying to mold me into the kind of man who could impress her family. The problem was, she didn't want me to actually be successful. She just wanted me to look successful in front of them. Vanessa's mother had never approved of me. Her father, a businessman, saw me as a man with no real prospects. Her brothers, both in corporate finance, treated me like some lost cause, a charity case Vanessa had taken under her wing. Rachel, her younger sister, was the only one who had ever been kind to me. But kindness wouldn't change the fact that I was about to walk into a room filled with people who had already decided I wasn't good enough. Vanessa made sure I understood that as we got ready. "Don't get into any debates with my dad this time. Please don't bring up your restaurant like it's some big deal. And for God's sake, try not to look so miserable when my mom talks to you." She didn't say these things with malice. No, that would have required effort. She said them with indifference, with that effortless arrogance she had perfected over the years. I simply nodded, buttoning my blazer in the mirror, keeping my thoughts to myself. She didn't need to know that I had personally approved the reservation. She didn't need to know that the head chef was my employee, that the wine list was my selection, that every waiter she would be snapping her fingers at worked under my payroll. Let her bask in her ignorance. Let her think she was dragging me along to a place she believed was far above my standing, because the deeper the lie, the sweeter the truth would taste when it finally hit her. Walking into the restaurant that night felt different. Not because of the occasion. I'd been to plenty of celebrations. It was different because I was walking into my own kingdom, disguised as a commoner. Vanessa strutted ahead of me, her black satin dress clinging to her body as she walked with the confidence of a woman who believed she was superior to everyone in the room, including her own husband. She didn't wait for me. She didn't even check if I was behind her. That was the way it always was. I was just an accessory in her world. The moment we stepped inside, I spotted my staff. They saw me too, but none of them acknowledged me. Not yet. They knew better. I had given them strict instructions to treat me like any other guest. It was all part of the plan. At the far end of the restaurant, a long table was set up with a floral arrangement in the center, wine glasses gleaming under the chandelier lights. The guests were already seated, engaged in lively conversation. I recognized the voices immediately. Vanessa's parents, her brothers, their wives, her cousins, and, of course, Rachel, the only person at that table who didn't treat me like a second-class citizen. "David." Rachel greeted me with a warm smile as I pulled out a chair next to Vanessa. I returned her smile. "Congratulations, Rachel. I heard you graduated at the top of your class." She laughed. "You heard right. Unlike some people at this table, actually worked hard in college." The jab was subtle, but I caught it. Her older brother, Mark, smirked, and his wife giggled behind a glass of champagne. "That's right, Rachel," Mark said, tilting his glass toward her. "Not everyone can be as focused as you. Some people settle for mediocrity." His eyes flicked toward me when he said it. So we were starting early tonight." I didn't react. I had played this game before. If I responded too quickly, I'd come off as defensive. If I ignored it, I'd seem weak. Instead, I picked up my menu and pretended to browse, waiting for the next shot to come. And, as expected, it did. "So, David," Vanessa's father, Richard, said as he set down his drink, what was it again? The little food business?" "The restaurant is doing well," I replied evenly, pretending to stay focused on the menu. "Ah, that's nice," he said, already disinterested. "I always tell my clients, if you find yourself struggling, there's no shame in pivoting. Maybe you should consider other opportunities, something real." Vanessa chuckled beside me, sipping her wine. "Dad, you know David. He's passionate about his little kitchen." Little. That word sat there between us like a loaded gun. I let them laugh. I let them have their moment. It wasn't time yet. The waiter came to take our orders. Vanessa leaned back in her seat, smug, as she glanced over the menu. "Ugh, I hate having to choose," she whined dramatically. "Babe, you work here, right? Why don't you surprise me with something?" Laughter erupted around the table. Rachel looked uncomfortable, but the rest of them enjoyed the spectacle. I closed my menu and set it down, my expression calm. "I don't work here," I said, meeting Vanessa's eyes. She grinned. Right. You run this place, huh? My husband, the big-time restaurant guy." The laughter grew louder. Vanessa clapped her hands together. "You know what? Why don't you go tell the chef to make something special for me? Use your connections, babe." That's when she did it. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a $5 bill, and slid it across the table toward me. "For your efforts," she said, eyes twinkling with amusement. The room exploded in laughter. I sat there, staring at the bill, feeling every single gaze on me. This wasn't just mockery anymore. This was a performance, a public spectacle, orchestrated at my expense. I could feel my staff watching from the corners of the restaurant. My employees, the people who knew who I was, the people who respected me. They stood in silence, waiting. They knew what was about to happen. I reached for the bill, twirled it between my fingers, and smiled. Then, I raised my hand and gave the signal. The countdown had begun. The laughter swelled around me, echoing off the high ceilings of my restaurant, filling every corner with the sound of my own wife's mockery. The crisp $5 bill sat between my fingers, an unspoken dare, an insult wrapped in thinly veiled amusement. I could feel the weight of their gazes, Vanessa's smug smirk, her father's patronizing glance, Mark's sneering grin. They thought they were witnessing my defeat, that this was just another night where I swallowed my pride and played along like the obedient, insignificant husband they had crafted in their minds. But they had no idea. I turned the bill over in my hands, examining it as though it were something foreign, something I had never seen before. Slowly, I placed it back down on the table, right in front of Vanessa. "That's generous of you," I said smoothly, my voice level. "You sure you can afford it?" The laughter quieted slightly, uncertainty flickering across a few faces. Vanessa rolled her eyes, reaching for her wine. "Oh, don't be so sensitive, babe. It's just a joke," she said, swirling the glass. "You do work here, don't you?" I leaned back in my chair, my fingers interlocked, completely at ease. "You know, Vanessa," I mused, tilting my head slightly, "it's funny. You've never actually asked me what I do here." She scoffed. "I don't need to ask. I already know. You run food, you manage tables, maybe you even wash a few dishes when it gets busy. There's no shame in that. It's honest work." I caught the way Mark bit his lip, holding back a laugh, and how Vanessa's mother raised an eyebrow in subtle disapproval, as if she were waiting for me to react, to cause a scene, to embarrass myself further. But I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, I gave them exactly what they wanted: silence. I let them enjoy their moment, let them revel in their superiority, let them bask in the glow of their own arrogance. I let them feel victorious. Because victory tastes so much sweeter when it's ripped away. I shifted my gaze toward the entrance of the restaurant, where my manager, Daniel, stood. He had been watching everything unfold from a distance, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for my cue. I gave him the smallest nod. And then, the game changed. It started subtly. The waiters, who had been moving gracefully between tables, suddenly stopped. Trays of food that had been prepared in the kitchen remained there, untouched. The hum of conversation from other diners continued, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. But at our table, the service had come to a screeching halt. Vanessa didn't notice at first. She was too busy relishing her own cleverness, too busy drinking and laughing. But then Mark raised a hand, signaling for a waiter. No one came. He frowned, glancing around. Excuse me? Silence. Rachel's fiancé, Derek, waved down a passing waiter, a young woman balancing an empty tray. Hey, can we get some refills here? The waitress hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward me for the briefest second before she responded with a polite but firm, I'm sorry, sir. Service has been paused. The shift in the air was immediate. Paused, Mark repeated, his voice laced with confusion. What the hell does that mean? The waitress gave a tight-lipped smile. It means we are no longer serving this table. Dead silence. It took Vanessa a few seconds to process the words. She blinked, slowly lowering her wine glass. Wait, what? The waitress simply turned and walked away, leaving the table in stunned silence. I watched as my father-in-law's face twisted in irritation, his businessman's mind already calculating whether he should demand to speak to a manager. Spoiler alert, he was already speaking to the owner. What kind of joke is this? Vanessa's mother muttered, glancing at her husband. Richard, say something. Richard pushed back his chair, already preparing to storm toward the front desk. But before he could rise, Daniel beat him to it. Is there a problem here? My manager asked, his voice smooth but authoritative. Yeah, Mark snapped. Your staff is ignoring us. What kind of place are you running? Daniel's lips curled slightly, his gaze flicking toward me for approval. I gave the smallest of nods, barely noticeable to anyone else. And that's when the bomb dropped. I apologize for the inconvenience, Daniel said, his voice calm. But as per the owner's request, we will no longer be serving this party tonight. It was like watching a domino effect in slow motion. The smirk fell from Mark's lips. Richard froze mid-motion, his fingers tightening around the linen napkin in his lap. Vanessa's mother's perfectly manicured hand twitched slightly, as if she were about to throw a fit but hadn't quite figured out how to react yet. And then there was Vanessa. Her head turned so slowly toward me, I could almost hear the gears in her mind screeching to a halt. Her expression went from amused, to confused, to dawning horror. Her lips parted. What did he just say? I lifted my glass of water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and then set it back down. Then, I smiled. Oh, I didn't tell you? I said, feigning innocence. I don't work here. I own here. There was a certain beauty in silence, the kind that stretched between words, thick with unspoken realization, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats, their minds racing to catch up to a truth they never saw coming. And right now, that silence belonged to Vanessa. She stared at me, her face frozen in an expression I had never seen before, one that teetered between confusion and outright panic. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. Around the table, the others weren't faring much better. Mark looked like someone had yanked the floor out from under him. Rachel's fiancé, Derek, leaned back, rubbing his chin, suddenly intrigued by a man he had dismissed as insignificant not even an hour ago. Vanessa's mother pressed her lips into a thin line, while Richard, the all-knowing, all-powerful businessman, narrowed his eyes at me, as if he were attempting to reassess my worth in real time. But my favorite reaction? The quiet, almost imperceptible gasp from Vanessa herself. Finally, she managed to speak. You're joking, she said, her voice weaker than before. David, this isn't funny. I tilted my head slightly, enjoying the moment. Why would I joke about something like that? She let out a forced laugh, shaking her head as if trying to reset reality. Babe, come on. You don't own this place. I've been here before, and you've never once mentioned it. Strange, isn't it? I mused, swirling the water in my glass. How you've been here so many times and never thought to ask who actually runs it. Her eyes darted toward the restaurant manager, Daniel, who stood just a few feet away, watching the unraveling drama with an expression of careful neutrality. She turned back to me, desperate now. "David, tell them you're joking." I smiled. "All right, I'm joking." Relief flashed across her face, and then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and dropped my voice to a near whisper. "Except, I'm not." The relief vanished instantly. At that moment, Richard cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "David, you manage a restaurant. Owning one is an entirely different thing." I met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "I agree. Owning one is different. That's why I don't just own one." The confusion deepened. I could see them struggling, trying to fit this new version of me into the box they had crafted so carefully over the years. In their minds, I was a struggling, unambitious man who had somehow tricked Vanessa into marrying him. That was the narrative they had clung to. And now, that narrative was shattering. Mark, always the first to challenge, let out a sharp laugh. "Bullshit. You expect us to believe you own this place? Where's the proof?" I didn't even blink. Instead, I turned to Daniel and gave a casual nod. Daniel reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out a neatly folded ownership document, and placed it on the table in front of them. Vanessa's father snatched it up, unfolding it quickly. His eyes scanned the paper, and as he read the name at the bottom, "My name," his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Vanessa leaned over his shoulder, reading the same document. I watched as her breath hitched. She knew my signature well. That's not possible," she whispered, her fingers tightening around the paper. "You never mentioned this." I shrugged. Would it have mattered if I did? Her head snapped up, and I saw something new in her eyes. Something deeper than shock. Fear. She had built her entire identity around being better than me, around the belief that she had married below her station. But now, she was realizing the truth. She had married a man she had never truly known, and she had spent the last few years mocking a man she never deserved. I leaned back, exhaling as if I were finally setting down a burden I had carried for far too long. "Now, about that service," I said, turning to Daniel. "I believe I gave an order, didn't I?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir. Service to this table has been permanently suspended." The murmur of other guests in the restaurant continued around us. Plates clinked, waiters moved, conversations flowed. But at our table, nothing. No more drinks. No more food. No more service. I watched as realization dawned on Vanessa's family, one by one. Mark clenched his fists. "You can't do this." I gave him a pointed look. "I just did." "You're embarrassing us." Vanessa's mother hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm embarrassing you?" I wasn't the one who mocked my own husband in front of 41 guests. I wasn't the one who treated the man who pays for this food like a joke. But you're right. This is embarrassing. Just not for me. Vanessa's face had gone completely pale. But I cut her off with a single raised hand. "I think we're done here." And just like that, I pushed back my chair and stood. Daniel followed suit, stepping aside as I turned toward the exit. But before I left, I glanced over my shoulder, locking eyes with Vanessa one last time. "You wanted me to impress your family, right?" I said, voice laced with amusement. Then I smiled. "Consider them impressed." And with that, I walked away. I didn't need to turn around to know what was happening behind me. I could hear it. The scraping of chairs. The rising panic in their voices. The unmistakable shift in the air as realization sank its claws into each and every one of them. Vanessa had spent years painting me as a joke, a man with no ambition, no real standing. And now, she and her family were trapped in a reality they had never imagined. A restaurant they could not control, owned by the man they had spent the entire night ridiculing. I heard Mark's voice first. Loud, irritated, demanding. "Wait. Hold on, we're not done here." Then came Richard, Vanessa's father, his businessman's arrogance still intact despite the undeniable truth sitting right in front of him. "This is absurd. We have a reservation. You can't just cut off service." I let out a quiet chuckle, my steps slowing slightly before I turned just enough to look over my shoulder. You're right, I mused, my voice carrying effortlessly across the now silent table. You had a reservation. Past tense. Richard's face reddened. This is a highly unprofessional way to run a business, David. I smirked. You seem to have mistaken me for someone who cares about your opinion. Gasps rippled across the table. Vanessa's mother clutched at her pearl necklace like she had just witnessed an unspeakable crime. This is beyond childish, she spat, glaring at me like I was some disobedient servant. You can't just refuse to serve us because of a little joke. My eyes flicked to Vanessa. She wasn't laughing now. Her hands were clenched together in her lap, her shoulders stiff. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, like she was just now grasping the magnitude of what was happening. Good. She had spent years making me feel small. It was about time she knew what that felt like. I turned my attention back to the table, exhaling like I was bored of the conversation. Let me make this simple for you, I said, my tone cool and even. You came to my establishment, spent the entire night belittling me, and then expected me to serve you like nothing happened. I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. You see, the thing about power is, the people who truly have it don't need to announce it. They just use it. Richard's jaw tightened. Vanessa's mother looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Mark, ever the arrogant fool, rolled his eyes. Okay, fine. We get it. You're rich now. You proved your little point. Can we just eat? I tilted my head. No. The air shifted again. Heavier now, thicker. Mark scoffed. What do you mean, no? I smiled. I mean no. No food. No drinks. No service. You and your 41 guests are officially cut off. Vanessa's mother gasped. Cut off? You can't do that. I shrugged. I can. And I just did. The silence stretched so thin. I could hear the ice melting in their untouched glasses. But everyone is expecting food. Rachel finally spoke, her voice tinged with disbelief. She wasn't part of their mockery, and I almost felt bad for her. Almost. I met her gaze. You can all stay and enjoy the ambience if you'd like. But as far as food is concerned, I grinned. You'll have to find another restaurant willing to serve you this late on a Saturday night. And considering you had a set menu and a private section reserved, good luck getting another place to take in 41 unplanned guests. Rachel's mouth opened, then closed. She knew I was right. It was past 9. Most high-end restaurants weren't taking walk-ins anymore. Not for a group this size. Panic started setting in. Some of Vanessa's relatives were already shifting in their seats, whispering among themselves. The weight of what was happening was sinking in. They were about to be humiliated. Not just because they had mocked me. Not just because they had underestimated me. But because I had publicly stripped them of their illusion of superiority. Vanessa's father turned to her, his face pinched with anger. Fix this. Vanessa flinched. For the first time ever, she was in a position where she had no control. No clever remarks. No smug comebacks. Just raw, painful reality. She swallowed, forcing her voice to steady. David, please. It was the please that caught my attention. Not because it was sincere, but because it was desperate. She didn't care that she had humiliated me. She didn't care about the years of disrespect, the insults, the condescension. She cared about her own embarrassment. That's when I knew. She wasn't apologizing because she regretted how she treated me. She was apologizing because, for the first time in her life, she needed me, and I wasn't going to save her. I took a deep breath, then smiled. Enjoy your night, Vanessa. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away. The sound of 41 people being left without food followed me out the door. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel the weight of 41 sets of eyes drilling into my back. The disbelief, the growing anger, the desperation creeping into their voices as they realized I wasn't bluffing. I had taken everything they thought they controlled. The power, the narrative, the illusion that they were above me. And flipped it in one calculated move. But I wasn't done yet. I stopped just short of the doorway, turning slightly so I could take in the absolute mess unraveling at the table. Vanessa was gripping the edge of the table, like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her face had gone pale, her carefully curated confidence shattered. Richard, her father, was rubbing his temples, fuming in silence. I could almost see the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster before word spread. Mark? Well, Mark was still in denial. This is insane, he scoffed, shaking his head. You're seriously going to let your own wife sit here, humiliated, while the entire family goes hungry? I let out a small, amused chuckle. Wife? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. That's interesting, because she didn't seem to remember she had a husband when she spent the last hour mocking me in front of everyone. Vanessa's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the napkin in her lap. I stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. I want you all to understand something, I continued, my voice dropping just enough to make them lean in, to listen. What happened here tonight? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't some impulsive, petty revenge. I placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, my gaze sweeping across them. It was a lesson. Richard scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Spare us the theatrics, David. You're acting like this is some grand moment. It's just a restaurant. I smirked. Is it? I straightened, slipping my hands into my pockets as I turned my full attention to Vanessa. Vanessa, I said casually, remind me, how long have we been married? Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. 6 years. 6 years, I repeated, nodding thoughtfully. And in those 6 years, how many times have you asked me about my work? Not assumed, not mocked, but actually asked? Silence. Vanessa lowered her gaze. How many times, I pressed, have you treated what I do as something important instead of just some little food business? Nothing. Not a single word. I let the silence hang between us before sighing and shaking my head. You see, that's the problem, I said, stepping back. You never actually cared about what I was building. You only cared about whether it looked impressive enough to brag about. I turned to Richard, tilting my head. And you? You're a businessman, aren't you? He frowned. Of course. Then tell me, Richard, I continued. Wouldn't a smart businessman look into the ownership of a restaurant before bringing 41 guests to eat there? His nostrils flared slightly. I smiled. Guess you're not as sharp as you think you are. A low, disbelieving murmur rippled through the table. Vanessa's mother inhaled sharply, shaking her head. This is cruel. What kind of man humiliates his wife like this? I turned back to Vanessa, raising an eyebrow. What kind of wife humiliates her husband in front of her entire family? Her mother's mouth opened, then closed. I glanced at my watch, then gave Daniel, the restaurant manager, a small nod. He cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his tone completely professional. As per Mr. Lawson's request, this table's reservation has now been officially canceled. If you wish to continue your evening elsewhere, we highly recommend finding another establishment. The finality in his voice sent a fresh wave of panic through Vanessa's relatives. You can't be serious, Mark hissed. You're actually kicking us out? I grinned. I'm doing more than that, I said smoothly. I'm giving you an experience you'll never forget. Vanessa finally snapped. Her chair scraped back as she stood abruptly, her eyes flashing with desperation. David, please, she blurted out, her voice breaking. Don't do this. I tilted my head. Do what? She exhaled shakily. You made your point, okay? I messed up. But can we fix this? I let out a soft chuckle. Fix this? I echoed. Vanessa, this isn't a problem for me. It's a problem for you. Her lower lip trembled slightly. I sighed, shaking my head. You spent our entire marriage looking down on me, I murmured. You thought I wasn't good enough. Thought I'd never be more than some lowly restaurant worker. I leaned in, my voice dropping just for her. So tell me, Vanessa, how does it feel to find out that the lowly restaurant worker you married, I pulled back, my smile sharp, owns the place where you just embarrassed yourself? She let out a shaky breath, her pride crumbling right in front of me. I straightened, adjusting my cufflinks. Daniel, make sure their bill is settled. And then? I smirked. Escort them out. Daniel didn't hesitate. As you wish, sir, he said before turning to the now humiliated guests. Ladies and gentlemen, this way, please. There was a brief moment where Vanessa's family just sat there, too stunned to move. Then, one by one, they stood. And with every step they took toward the exit, their dignity shrunk. As Vanessa passed me, she looked up, her eyes full of something that almost looked like regret. Almost. But regret doesn't erase years of mockery. It doesn't erase the way she had made me feel. And now, she knew exactly what it felt like to be dismissed, belittled, discarded. I didn't say another word. I just watched as the woman who once thought she had married beneath her walked out of the restaurant owned by the man she had never truly known. The last of Vanessa's family shuffled out of the restaurant, their once lively, boastful voices now reduced to hushed whispers of shame and disbelief. The great Richard, Vanessa's father, who once looked at me like an insect beneath his notice, had walked out of my establishment like a man who had just lost a fortune. His wife clung to his arm, her expression one of pure humiliation. Mark, the self-proclaimed golden child of the family? He had stormed out first, his face red with rage, barely able to process the fact that the man he had spent years belittling had just publicly embarrassed him in a way he'd never forget. But Vanessa? Vanessa was the slowest to leave. She lingered near the doorway, standing just beneath the golden glow of the chandelier. Her once perfect posture was gone. Her shoulders hunched slightly, her hands gripping the clutch at her side as if it were the only thing holding her together. She turned to me, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something. For a split second, I almost expected an apology. But what came out instead? Did you really have to do that? I almost laughed. That was what she had to say. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I was wrong. Just another attempt to shift the blame. I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. Wow, I murmured, running a hand down my face. Even now, after everything, you still don't get it, do you? She flinched, but I wasn't done. You humiliated me for years, I said, my voice eerily calm. Made me feel like less of a man, like I wasn't good enough, like my success, my ambition, meant nothing because it didn't come with a corporate title. I stepped closer, and for the first time ever, Vanessa took a step back. You never cared about what I built. You only cared about what you could tell people, I continued. And when you realized you couldn't use my success to brag, you dismissed it. You dismissed me. Her lips trembled slightly. David, I held up a hand. Save it. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the strap of her clutch. I just don't understand why you had to take it that far, she whispered. You made me look like a fool in front of my family. I laughed. Vanessa, you didn't need my help to look like a fool, I said. You did that all by yourself. She opened her mouth, but before she could respond, Daniel, my manager, cleared his throat. Sir, he said, stepping beside me, the final bill has been settled. Vanessa's brows furrowed. What bill? I smiled. The one your family ran up before they realized they wouldn't be eating here tonight. Her jaw slackened slightly. You charged them? I nodded. Of course. Why wouldn't I? But we didn't eat. I tilted my head. Didn't matter. You see, Vanessa, reservations at a restaurant like this? I gestured around. They come with a prepaid service fee. Meaning, whether you eat or not, once you book the table, you pay. The realization hit her all at once. She paled. Oh my God. I gave her a small, mocking smile. Oh, don't look so shocked, I mused. After all, you were so proud of choosing this place. Consider it a lesson in proper dining etiquette. She staggered slightly, gripping the back of a chair for balance. $10,000, Daniel added smoothly. She looked at him, eyes wide. What? That was the total amount billed for your party, he clarified. Since service was cut short, we deducted the cost of the actual food, but the reservation itself is non-refundable. Vanessa's breath caught. $10,000, she whispered, horror creeping into her voice. I chuckled. Don't worry, Vanessa. I'm sure your dad will take care of it. He's a big businessman, after all. Her fingers curled into fists. "This isn't fair," she muttered. "This isn't." I cut her off. "Neither is spending years belittling your husband only to find out he was the man you should have been proud of." She shut her eyes tightly, like she could block out the truth. But the truth was already written all over the night. Her family had mocked the man who owned the ground they stood on. And now, she was facing the consequences. I stepped back, nodding toward the exit. "You should go, Vanessa. Your family's waiting." She hesitated. For the first time in our entire marriage, she looked uncertain. "David, She trailed off, biting her lip. I held her gaze for a moment before shaking my head. "It's too late," I said simply. Her face fell. She lingered for another second, as if hoping I'd change my mind. But I had already given her more chances than she deserved. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor. I watched her go, feeling nothing. No regret, no sadness, just peace. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one walking away feeling small. I was the one leaving with my pride intact. The moment Vanessa disappeared through the doors, the tension in the restaurant dissolved like mist under the morning sun. I let out a slow, steady breath, running a hand over my jaw as I finally felt free. Not just from the dinner, not just from her family, from her. For 6 years, I had allowed myself to be molded into the role she and her family assigned me. The lesser man, the one they tolerated but never respected. And for 6 years, I let them believe it. Tonight had been a long overdue correction. Daniel stood beside me, arms crossed, a knowing smirk on his face. That was something. I huffed a quiet laugh. It was, wasn't it? "You should have seen their faces when they realized they weren't eating here," he mused. "That was priceless." I grinned, shaking my head. "I hope the memory keeps them full, because they're going to be hungry for a while." Daniel chuckled, then nodded toward the exit. She looked like she wanted to say something before she left. I knew what he meant. Vanessa had lingered, hesitated, struggled with the weight of her own downfall. But in the end, it hadn't mattered. Because I had given her something far more valuable than a second chance. I had given her consequences. I exhaled, loosening the collar of my shirt. "Doesn't matter," I murmured. "She made her bed. And now she has to lie in it," Daniel finished. I nodded. "Exactly." Just then, one of the waiters, Aisha, approached hesitantly. "Sir? There's a couple at table 14 asking if you're available." I frowned. "Who?" "They said they're regulars. They saw what happened earlier and wanted to congratulate you on." She trailed off, searching for the right words. I smirked. "On putting my wife in her place." Aisha grinned. "Something like that." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Tell them I'll be there in a moment." She nodded and walked off, and for the first time that night, I realized something. I felt lighter than I had in years. Because for the first time in my marriage, I hadn't just taken Vanessa's cruelty, I had fought back. And I had won. I turned to Daniel. "Make sure my wife and her family are permanently blacklisted." His smirk widened. "Already done." I grinned. "Good man." With that, I rolled my shoulders, straightened my cuffs, and strode toward table 14. Toward people who actually respected me. Because this was my world. And I had no more room in it for people who didn't see my worth. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. No calls. No texts. No desperate attempts from Vanessa to explain herself. At first, I thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally accepted her loss. That she had looked in the mirror, faced the truth, and realized she had ruined her own marriage. But I should have known better. Because Vanessa? She never accepted blame. She only delayed her response until she could spin it in a way that made her the victim. So when she finally showed up at my office 3 days later, her makeup perfect, her heels clicking confidently against the marble floors, I knew exactly what was coming. A performance. I leaned back in my chair, watching as she gracefully lowered herself into the seat across from me. "You've been avoiding me," she started, her tone soft, almost casual. I arched an eyebrow. "Wasn't aware I owed you a conversation after what happened." Her lips pressed together, but she quickly recovered, letting out a small sigh. Look, David. I know I messed up, she admitted, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I shouldn't have. I mean, the jokes, the way I talked about you in front of my family, it was wrong. I see that now. I said nothing. Just sat there, watching, waiting. Because apologies from Vanessa? They were never just apologies. And sure enough, after a beat, she continued. But did you really have to go that far? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Did you have to humiliate me like that? You didn't just prove a point, David. You burned every bridge between me and my family. I huffed a small laugh, shaking my head. You burned those bridges yourself, Vanessa. The only difference is, this time, you had an audience. Her jaw clenched slightly, but she forced a smile. Look, let's not do this. We've been married for 6 years, David. We can work through this. I made a mistake, and I'm willing to make things right. Just tell me what you need from me. I tilted my head, studying her. She was good. The way she played her words. The way she shifted the blame just enough to avoid full responsibility while still pretending to be remorseful. But I wasn't the same gullible husband she had walked all over for years. So I simply reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the divorce papers. The smile dropped from her face immediately. She stared at the stack of papers like it was a ticking bomb, her breath catching. What is this? I placed them in front of her, along with a pin. It's exactly what it looks like, I said. You wanted to know what I need from you? I nodded at the documents. I need you to sign. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. You're joking. I didn't blink. I'm not. Her expression twisted, her composure cracking. David, come on. You're being dramatic. This is ridiculous. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk. No, Vanessa. What's ridiculous is spending 6 years married to a woman who only respected me when she thought I was beneath her. Her eyes flickered. That's not true. Really? I cut her off. Then tell me, would you have treated me the same way if you had known I owned that restaurant from the beginning? Silence. That's what I thought. I exhaled, shaking my head. You don't love me, Vanessa. You love control. And now that you've lost it, you suddenly want to fix things. I pushed the papers toward her. But I'm done being your little project. Your backup plan. Your convenient husband. If you had ever actually loved me, you wouldn't have spent years making me feel like I wasn't enough. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time, she looked scared. Because this wasn't something she could fix with an apology. This wasn't something she could undo with sweet words or crocodile tears. This was final. David, she whispered, her voice small. Please. I exhaled slowly, then shook my head. I used to beg for your respect, I murmured. Now? I wouldn't take it if you handed it to me on a silver platter. Her eyes glistened slightly. Whether it was genuine regret or just the fear of losing her comfortable life, I didn't know. And I didn't care. I tapped the pen against the table. Sign it, Vanessa. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, with a trembling breath, she reached forward and signed her name. The second the ink dried, something shifted between us. The power balance she had controlled for years? Gone. I took the papers, neatly stacking them before standing to my feet. You can have until the end of the week to pack your things. Her lips trembled. That's it, she whispered. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. That's it. Because I was done. Done trying. Done proving myself to someone who would never see my worth. And as Vanessa walked out of my office, her posture stiff, her movements slow, I realized something. She wasn't just leaving my office. She was walking out of the life she could have had. And I was finally free.